So the issue of relevance brings us to shifting the focus to issues that we're going to be exploring later in the course, but it does address the issue of how is schooling and what we're doing in schooling positioned relative to society? How is it relating to the world that the students, the readers are engaged in? And if you look at it over time, countless people have discussed this issue. I remember in the 1956 book that William S. Gray did for UNESCO entitled The Teaching of Reading and Writing, he talked about literacy programs all over the world, and he particularly talked about one situation where where they were doing literacy programs. I think it was in Indonesia, and they created these great literacy programs, and at first people were very interested, but the interest faded. And when they questioned people about it, the response was pretty straightforward. They said, we will come, and all of us will come, if you help us be better farmers. And what they're saying there is, oftentimes I think they were finding in these sort of workshops, these tutoring experience or whatnot, these, in this case, what they were called functional literacy programs, that they really weren't connecting to the world of the people they were trying to serve. I spoke at a conference in Ghana once, and I was stunned at the difference between this conference, it was a conference about reading, than what I had experienced in the West. I would say pretty well almost all the presentations by the Africans, and it was a Pan-African conference, talked about reading in relationship to issues of health, issues of agriculture, issues that connected with the real world. And it was so different, the engagement of the audience as they talked about literacy in these terms. It wasn't sort of reading as an end unto itself, which seems to oftentimes pervade conferences in the West. And so if you look at other people, one of the most popular set of books on teaching that came out I think in the 50s was by a European author, but in New Zealand, a woman by the name of Sylvia Ashton Warner, where she was working with Indigenous New Zealanders and other New Zealanders in schools. And she was very interested in creating material that represented their lives. And she talked extensively about her approach, which she termed organic teaching. And then in the 50s and 60s, there was a work in Appalachia where I want to say Elliot Wigington engaged his students in actually exploring their culture and their community and putting out a publication for their community on different events and different traditions, in a sense connecting with it. And then some of the powerful work that a woman who was in the Department of Anthropology at the University of Arizona when I was there, Susan Phillips, who had done a lot of research on the Warm Springs Indian Reservation in Oregon, looking at the differences in educational engagement of Indigenous Native Americans when they're engaged in participation structures that were consistent with how they engage collaboratively with one another in their communities. Indeed, I think if you start to apply this critical cultural ecological, you'll find a lot of work in the Indigenous space that really raises questions as to how schools are positioned in terms of society and offers recommendations of ways forward so that students are able to engage and see the relevance of what's going on in their schooling to the projects that are part of their everyday life. In one sense, it reflects some of the stuff that has occurred historically in South America in conjunction with Paulo Freire's discussions of literacy, and Augusta Boel's The Theatre of the Oppressed, where he engaged community people in bringing these sort of issues and using a theatre to dramatize how they might proceed. A sort of a way of sort of a pedagogy which actually engages with the real world of social action that people are interested in pursuing. Or I'm reminded of the Nicaraguan literacy campaign when they questioned the guy who initiated that. They said, well, why are you pursuing this huge literacy campaign? He said, we want to make our citizens participants in their society, not spectators of it. And I thought, wow, I mean, that sort of captures that issue of how do we create programs that are relevant. When I was doing some work in Botswana, I was struck by the distance between what kids are doing in their schools and their community. And not surprising, when the kids graduate from school, they go to urban centres looking for work, because what they've learned in schools is quite often abstract and academic and quite detached from the sorts of things that they might bring to bear in their communities. In the Queensland's new basic programs, what I was struck by was this search for rich literacy tasks which connected with communities as being the anchor in terms of moving forward in terms of the literacy program. Or the wonderful Reggio Emilia preschools in Italy, where a key focus of that is coming up with projects with the community involved, so that the schools aren't detached from the community, the schools are part of the community, and the projects that the students are involved in are part of what the whole community contributes to. And it might be, they might be doing a project around games or things like that, or creating little models and things like that, but they're projects that the community members and the young children are deciding together and are involved in together. That the school isn't something or other which locks the public out. The school opens its door and together they work as a collective. I think perhaps some of the most powerful work in terms of connecting schooling to issues of society and culture is the work in New Zealand, which I think to some extent grew out of the creation or the re-establishment of Maori language with language nests at the preschool level, and then went on to the establishing of Maori elementary schools and secondary schools and Maori universities. Interestingly, I will talk at length about this when we deal with this topic. But the extent to which they bring in their practices from their community into the schooling, and also press to be sure that in terms of education, there's Maori governance, there's Maori self-determination, and there's family involvement, that they are driven by a sort of a Maori thesis of education. Indeed, I'm so troubled when I hear my Australian Aboriginal colleagues talk about feeling as if they're guests in their country. Here we have an Indigenous population whose curriculum is not theirs, and so they don't feel as if the school is a place which is their home. So as I think about this relevance hypothesis, and we'll get into this in subsequent things, and we talk about these strategies, a key issue I think really gets down to sort of looking at school and society, and maybe taking a step back and taking a little bit of an aerial view of how schools fit into this planet. And oftentimes I think if I was to draw it out, where you've got schools and society and culture, and the experiences that people bring, and I think it's hard to sort of figure out what the boundaries are in terms of this. But I suspect if I was looking to place to diagram schools in respect to that, I certainly wouldn't be putting them entirely within that circle. I'd probably put them outside. That is, unless I'm part of that society and culture that's privileged by the curriculum, what is taught, what material, and the projects that are initiated. I actually, unfortunately, think that I suspect that even those whose Western curriculum is supported would probably suggest, yes, but the projects we're expected to do that aren't necessarily consistent with the types of things that we would find relevant. So returning to that relevant hypothesis, I suspect if you can think through that relevance thesis, you're on the verge of identifying projects that students will connect to more spontaneously, and as they connect and engage with these things, may find themselves enlisting strategies that are easy to help them develop in ways that they can apply independently, flexibly, and adaptively to other situations.